Well, good morning, everybody. It's Tuesday and welcome to Penn Vicarage. Lovely to see you this morning and thank you for joining us for our Bible reflection for today. Today it's Isaiah chapter 5. It's quite a long chapter. It's brilliant, lots of it. So here we go, Isaiah chapter 5. Here we go. Let me sing for my beloved a love song concerning his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. He dug it and cleared it of stones and planted it with choice vines. He built a watchtower in the midst of it and hewed out a vine vat in it. He expected it to wild grapes, but it yielded wild grapes. And now, inhabitants of Jerusalem and the people of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I've not done in it? When I expected it to yield grapes, why did it yield wild grapes? Now I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, and it shall be devoured. I'll break down its wall, and it shall be trampled down. I'll make it a waste. It shall not be pruned or hoed. It shall be overgrown with briars and thorns. I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain upon it. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the people of Judah are his pleasant planting. He expected justice, but saw bloodshed, righteousness, but heard a cry. To you who join house to house and add field to field, until there is room for no one but you, and you are left to live alone in the midst of the land. The Lord of hosts has sworn in my hearing, surely many houses shall be desolate, large and beautiful houses without inhabitants. For 10 acres of vineyard shall yield but one bath, and a homer of seed shall yield a mere ephah. You who rise early in the morning in pursuit of strong drink, who linger in the evening to be inflamed by wine, whose feasts consist of lyre and harp, tambourine and lute and flute and wine, but do not regard the deeds of the Lord, or see the work of his hands. Therefore my people go into exile without knowledge. Their nobles are dying of hunger, and their multitude is parched with thirst. Therefore Sheol has enlarged its appetite, and opened its mouth beyond measure. The nobility of Jerusalem and her multitude go down, her throng and all exult in her. People are bowed down, everyone is brought low, and the eyes of the haughty are humbled. But the Lord of hosts is exalted by justice, and the holy God shows himself holy by righteousness. Then the lambs shall graze as in their pasture, fatlings and kids shall feed among the ruins. You who drag iniquity along with cords of falsehood, who drag sin along as with cart ropes, who say, let him make haste that we may see it. Let the plan of the Holy One of Israel hasten to fulfillment, that we may know it. You who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. You who are wise in your own eyes and shrewd in your own sight. You who are heroes in drinking wine and valiant in mixing drink, who acquit the guilty for a bribe and deprive the innocent of their rights. Therefore, as the stubble of fire devours the stubble, and as dry grass sinks down in the flame, so their root will become rotten, and their blossom go up like the dust. For they have rejected the instruction of the Lord of hosts, and have despised the word of the Holy One of Israel. Therefore the anger of the Lord was kindled against his people, and he stretched out his hand against them and struck them. The mountains quaked, and their corpses were like refuse in the streets. For all this his anger is not turned away, and his hand is still stretched out. He will raise a signal for a nation far away, and whistle for a people at the ends of the earth. Here they come, swiftly, speedily. None of them is weary, none stumbles, none slumbers or sleeps. Not a loincloth is loose, not a sandal thong is broken. Their arrows are sharp, and their bows bent. Their horses' hooves seem like flint, and their wheels like the whirlwind. Their roaring is like a lion, and their young lions they roar. They growl and seize their prey. They carry it off, and no one can rescue. They will roar over it on that day, like the roaring of the sea. And if one look to the land, only darkness and distress, and the light grows dark with clouds. And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Okay, lots in this chapter. I'll try and do justice to it. Try not to overrun too much this morning. Firstly, we have this famous parable of the vineyard. It's referred to by Jesus later in Matthew 21. But here we have the original parable of the vineyard. And notice we have a bit of a vineyard and it's clearly God who sows a vineyard. And notice at the beginning the love and the care with which they do this. They put this vineyard on a fertile hill. The word fertile literally translates as horn of the son of fatness. So they put it on the vineyard is made on a particularly fertile place. Notice how it's dug, it's cleared of stones, how it's a watchtower is put up around it to guard it, and also a wine vat. And I gather the Hebrew for vat here is one that implies great abundance here. So this vineyard is built with great care, with great love, but also with great expectation too. Then notice then in verses 4 to 6, the huge sense of disappointment that comes in, that instead of grapes, it brings wild grapes, and it's a huge sense of disappointment. And you can really feel viscerally, you might say, the disappointment in this vineyard, which is there to make grapes, but just basically produces diddly squat. So you get this parable of this vineyard, which is built with such love and care and such expectation, has turned out to be so disappointment. And in the end, the owner of the vineyard says, "Okay, I'm just going to let the hedges down, and the whole place is going to be let to rack and ruin." So you hear this painful parable of love and care and so on in building this vineyard, but a huge sense of disappointment in it. That's what you get here in this parable. So then, what you have in verse 7, you have this clearly a parable of God and the people of Israel. God made God's people is the house of Judah with such hope and expectation, but it's turned out instead of having you have injustice and all that sort of stuff and bloodshed and so on. So it was made with such expectation. So God's loved his people so much, but instead of having fruitfulness and sort of care and love and justice, what you have is injustice and bloodshed and violence and so on instead. So feel the kind of sense of disappointment. So then, where has it all gone wrong? There's a whole series in here where God goes, and then so on, a bit like woe is. And there are several here in this chapter. I'll try and run through them. Firstly, 8 to 10, we have woe to those who join house to house. This essentially just people just gathering capital, just gathering land, just pulling it all together. And so many of these things are so accurate for today, because actually talk about people who just acquire wealth for its own sake. And notice here, the richer they get, the more lonely they get. Really quite carefully here. They're kind of left on their own. And in a sense, do we not do that today? The richer we get, actually, the lonelier we get. So you start by walking into town, and you meet people there. Then when you get a bit of money, you get the bus. And when you get more money, you get a car, and then you get a bigger car, and so on. Or people used to live in settlements, and then they lived in terrace houses. Then they lived in, and people aspire to live in great big houses out in Hollywood somewhere, surrounded by security guards. The richer we get, the more lonely we get, and you can see it here. And actually, you find also the richer they get, the less effective they become too. So in verses 8 to 10, you have problem here because people are just acquiring wealth for its own sake. Again, that is absolutely so accurate to today. Then you've got in verses 11 to 17, those who just acquire pleasure. You might call it hedonism, experts at mixing strong drink and so on, but are not interested in what God is doing. And again, you see so much of it today. We have a society full of pleasure and so on, absolutely fine. But the idea of what might God want, what's God's will for this, often gets forgotten about. So you see that too. Then you get in verses 18 to 20, those who kind of lost their moral compass, who call right wrong and wrong right. Again, you can see that around you too. And then they got in verse 21, you have people who think that they are, woe to those who think they are clever. Again, humanity and mankind has become thinks they are very clever these days. But again, we forget that we may be clever, but we're nowhere near as clever as God. In verse 22 and 23, you have injustice there, who acquit the guilty for a bribe, and so on. You've got bribery and corruption. There's a problem there as well. And so you get a whole series of woes there. You see where things have gone wrong in this vineyard, in God's people. It should have promised so much, but because of all these things, because people lost their moral compass, people forget, people think they're clever, because the people acquire wealth for its own sake, because people forget to ask what God wants, and so on and so on and so on. He's saying here, it's become a total mess. So then he goes on to talk about, I won't sing it, but there will be trouble ahead. And here, then in verses 26 to 30, you have a description here of what is to come. Now, Isaiah didn't know it because Isaiah had met them, but this army that's being talked about here is the army of the Assyrians. There will be hear much more about that in the next few days. Assyria is what is known today as Iraq, and it was one of the great superpowers of the day. And under a king called Tiglath-Pileser III, you'll hear more about him in a couple of days' time when we get on chapter 7, and so on. This great big army from the north, the Assyrians, did come, and they did do exactly what's mentioned here. Now, Isaiah, as I say, didn't know that, because he lived before it, it's prophecy, but that's what happened later. So because the kingdom had gone astray, as the vineyard was eventually destroyed, actually so was God's land as well, because it had gone rotten. And so you can kind of see it in this chapter. But before I finish, I mean, that is a fascinating parable in itself. You see a parable, the parable of the vineyard, feel the care, feel the heart, feel the love, feel the disappointment, feel what, and you can kind of see that's what actually happened. It will be remiss of me to end this talk without thinking about a parable in the New Testament in Matthew 20, chapter 21, where Jesus also tells a parable about a vineyard which is given to tenants, which is remarkably similar. And of course, Jesus was talking about the people of his day and using that, so he reworks the parable from today. But this was a devastating parable to the leaders at the time of Isaiah. And of course, the people listening to what Jesus was saying 1,000 years later, or 600 years later, or whatever, will have felt the same kind of thing. It's a similar sort of devastating parable for them too. So some things we to think about. One, as I say, is that compare it with the parable. If you've got some time today, compare it with the parable of the vineyard in chapter 21, Matthew chapter 21. Also think about when Jesus said, "I am the vine and you are the branches." But again, vines and vineyards, the importance of being fruitful in God too. And Jesus also tells a story about a fig tree. Okay, different fruit, but Jesus curses a fig tree, which is not actually producing any fruit. And the sense of disappointment for the fig tree is a bit like the disappointment in the vineyard here. And the disappointment with the leaders in Jesus' time, the religious leaders then, is like the disappointment of God with the religious leaders in the time of Isaiah. So 3 things we look at. The parable of the vineyard in Matthew chapter 21. Jesus saying, "I am the vine." I think that's John 15. And the parable of the fig tree. I wish I could remember the reference, but you can Google that for yourself. But lots of New Testament references for you to think about as well. All in all, a fascinating chapter, Isaiah chapter 5. Do read it again at your leisure. There's lots to think. It's an amazing chapter. It's long, but there's loads in it. Friends, have a lovely day. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found that really helpful. There'll be more again in a couple of days' time. Enjoy your